$13 billion. Your textbooks present this number as American generosity. The story goes like this. Europe lay in ruins after World War II. America, flush with cash and goodwill, wrote checks to rebuild the continent. Europeans rebuilt their cities. Democracy flourished. Communism retreated. Everyone won. This version of history makes a beautiful fairy tale. It also obscures the most sophisticated economic engineering operation of the 20th century. The Marshall Plan did not rebuild Europe through generosity. The money itself accounted for only 2.5% of recipient GDP across the program years from 1948 to 1952. This percentage does not explain the transformation. Countries have received far larger aid packages in the decades since and achieved nothing close to European recovery. The real mechanism hides in State Department archives, in Record Group 59 and Record Group 469 at the National Archives in Washington. These files contain the negotiation transcripts, the internal memos, and the conditionality terms attached to every dollar. The Marshall Plan worked because it forced 16 European governments to adopt policies their own populations would never have accepted. The money served as leverage. The conditions did the work. Welcome to Rashi Historical. We follow the money, trace the power, and expose the history they never taught you in school. This story matters to you right now because the same playbook operates today. When the International Monetary Fund attaches conditions to loans, when the World Bank demands reforms before releasing funds, when infrastructure investments come with strings attached, they follow the template created in 1948. The arguments you hear about development aid, about debt relief, about economic conditionality, trace directly back to the files we will examine in this script. The Marshall Plan created the machinery of modern economic influence. Understanding how it worked gives you the manual for understanding how economic power operates in your lifetime. Let us open those archives. George Marshall announced the plan in a speech at Harvard University on June 5, 1947. The Secretary of State stood at a podium and spoke for 11 minutes. He offered American assistance to European nations willing to cooperate in their own recovery. The speech contained no specific dollar amounts. Marshall made no detailed proposals. He issued an invitation and waited for responses. This vagueness was intentional. State Department planners wanted Europeans to design the program themselves. They wanted European governments to own the reforms, to claim credit for policies Washington had already decided to require. The internal planning documents tell a different story from the public speech. State Department officials had spent months identifying the structural bottlenecks preventing European recovery. They cataloged the problems with precision: currency instability, trade barriers between European nations, low industrial productivity, outdated management practices, and resistance to economic integration. American planners did not want to fix these problems directly. Direct intervention would create resentment and dependence. Instead, they designed a system of incentives. European governments would fix their own problems. American money would reward compliance. The European response came quickly. 16 nations sent representatives to Paris in July 1947. They formed the Committee of European Economic Cooperation and began drafting a recovery proposal. American observers attended these meetings. They did not dictate terms. They asked questions. They expressed concerns. They suggested modifications. The Europeans requested $29 billion over 4 years. American negotiators considered this figure excessive. They pushed back through informal channels. The request dropped to $22 billion as Congress eventually appropriated funds year by year, with the total reaching approximately $13 billion by 1952. The money came with requirements attached to every allocation. The Economic Cooperation Administration opened its doors in April 1948. President Harry Truman appointed Paul Hoffman, the president of Studebaker Automobile Company, to run it. Hoffman brought business discipline to foreign aid. He treated Marshall Plan assistance as an investment requiring returns. Each recipient nation signed a bilateral agreement with the United States. These agreements specified the conditions for receiving aid. The conditions fell into 3 categories: currency stabilization, trade liberalization, and productivity improvement. The bilateral agreements created a 2-tier system. The United States provided dollars to purchase American goods. These goods arrived in recipient countries and sold for local currency. The local currency payments went into counterpart funds controlled jointly by the recipient government and ECA officials. This counterpart fund mechanism gave American administrators direct influence over European fiscal policy. No government could spend its counterpart funds without ECA approval. The ECA used this leverage to push specific policies. France provides the clearest example. French counterpart funds totaled the equivalent of billions of francs. The French government wanted to spend these funds on colonial development and military operations in Indochina. The ECA refused to release funds for these purposes. American officials insisted on infrastructure investment, industrial modernization, and debt reduction. The French government protested. Internal ECA memos document months of negotiations. The Americans held firm. France needed the money. France accepted the conditions. This pattern repeated across every recipient nation. Italy wanted to use counterpart funds for current government expenses. The ECA demanded investment in productive capacity. The Netherlands sought funds for Indonesian operations. The ECA redirected money toward domestic reconstruction. The conditions operated through leverage, not force. No American troops enforced economic policies. No gunboats appeared in European harbors. The mechanism was simpler. Recipient governments needed continued aid flows. They needed American approval for counterpart fund releases. They modified their policies to maintain access. Record Group 469 at the National Archives contains the country files. These files document the specific conditions attached to each nation's program. They record the negotiations, the compromises, and the enforcement actions. They reveal a system of economic influence operating through financial incentives rather than military pressure. The OEEC added a second layer of conditionality. This organization brought together all 16 recipient nations to coordinate their recovery programs. The United States pushed for the OEEC to allocate aid among members based on collective assessment of needs and performance. This structure created peer pressure. European governments evaluated each other's policies, they competed for American approval, they policed each other's compliance with program requirements. The OEEC also forced European cooperation on trade policy. Member nations had to negotiate together to reduce barriers collectively to integrate their economies. This process laid the groundwork for later European integration. The European coal and steel community, the European economic community, and today's European Union all trace their institutional origins to patterns established through Marshall Plan conditionality. European currencies in 1947 existed in chaos. Exchange rates bore no relationship to economic reality. Governments printed money to cover budget deficits. Inflation eroded wages and savings. Black markets flourished because official prices meant nothing. The British pound, the French franc, the Italian lira, the German mark under occupation, and every other European currency faced the same fundamental problem. Governments had financed the war through debt and money creation. They continued these practices after the war ended. No political leader wanted to impose the austerity necessary to stabilize currencies. Voters would punish any government attempting fiscal discipline. The Marshall Plan changed this political calculation. State Department planners identified currency instability as the primary bottleneck preventing recovery. Without stable money, businesses would not invest. Without investment, production would not increase. Without production, living standards would not rise. Without rising living standards, communist parties would gain support. The bilateral agreements required recipient nations to pursue financial stability. This phrase sounds vague. The implementation was specific. ECA officials monitored government budgets. They tracked money supply growth. They watched inflation rates. They conditioned continued aid on progress towards stabilization. The counterpart fund mechanism made this conditionality effective. Governments needed to release counterpart funds for domestic investment. The ECA approved releases only when governments demonstrated commitment to anti-inflation policies. Italy provides the most dramatic case study. The Italian government in 1947 faced runaway inflation. The lira had lost most of its value since the war ended. The black market exchange rate diverged wildly from official rates. The Italian Communist Party, the largest in Western Europe, promised radical solutions. Luigi Einaudi served as Treasury Minister. He proposed drastic measures, credit restrictions, budget cuts, higher reserve requirements for banks. These policies would cause short-term pain. Unemployment would rise. Businesses would fail. The political costs appeared prohibitive. Marshall Plan conditionality provided political cover. Einaudi presented his stabilization program as a requirement for American aid. He shifted blame to Washington. The Italian government implemented the program in late 1947 and early 1948. Inflation dropped sharply. The lira stabilized. The April 1948 elections became a referendum on the Western orientation. The Christian Democrats won decisively. The Communists lost ground. American officials credited the economic stabilization with producing this political outcome. The pattern repeated elsewhere. French governments cycled through fiscal crises and stabilization attempts. Each crisis brought ECA pressure. Each stabilization attempt received ECA support. The Pinay Stabilization of 1952 finally brought lasting stability to the franc, coming at the end of the Marshall Plan period with conditionality requirements firmly established. West Germany presented unique challenges. The country remained under occupation. Currency reform required agreement among American, British, and French zones. The old Reichsmark had become worthless. Germans used cigarettes and coffee as alternative currencies. Ludwig Erhard pushed for comprehensive currency reform combined with price decontrol. Many officials considered this approach too radical. They feared social unrest and economic collapse. Marshall Plan financing provided the cushion necessary to attempt the experiment. The currency reform of June 1948 replaced the Reichsmark with the Deutsche Mark at a rate of 10-1 for most holdings. Prices came off controls almost immediately. Goods appeared in stores. Production surged. The German economic miracle began. ECA officials supported this reform through counterpart fund releases and continued dollar assistance. They provided the external resources necessary to survive the transition period. They conditioned this support on maintaining the new currency's stability. The currency stabilization requirements across Europe established a pattern still operating today. When the IMF conditions loans on fiscal discipline, when creditors demand balanced budgets before restructuring debt, when international institutions push for sound money, they follow the template established in 1948. European nations in 1947 traded with each other through bilateral barter arrangements. France would exchange wine for German coal. Italy would trade textiles for Dutch agricultural machinery. Each pair of countries kept separate accounts. Imbalances accumulated, trade ground toward a halt. This system made economic recovery impossible. Efficient production requires specialization. Specialization requires trade. Trade requires a functioning payment system. Europe had no functioning payment system. The bilateral barter system survived because it protected domestic industries from competition. French farmers did not want cheap Italian produce. German manufacturers did not want British competition. Every country maintained quotas, tariffs, and exchange controls, preventing the flow of goods across borders. European governments understood the problem. They lacked the political will to solve it. Trade liberalization would create winners and losers. The losers would protest. The winners would stay quiet. Politicians faced electoral incentives favoring protection. The Marshall Plan attacked this bottleneck through the OEEC. American planners insisted on European cooperation as a condition for assistance. They refused to deal with 16 separate bilateral programs. They demanded a collective approach. The OEEC became the vehicle for trade liberalization. The organization established the Intra-European Payments Union to replace bilateral barter with multilateral clearing. Countries accumulated credits or debits with the system as a whole rather than with each trading partner separately. Imbalances cleared through the central mechanism. This payments union required American financing to function. Countries with persistent deficits needed access to dollars to settle their accounts. The Marshall Plan provided these dollars. The provision came with conditions. Members must progressively reduce trade barriers. The OEEC set targets. Member nations committed to removing quotas on specific percentages of their trade. They submitted to peer review. They faced collective pressure to comply. The targets escalated over time. The initial commitment called for removing quotas on 50% of private trade. This target increased to 60%, then 75%. By the end of the Marshall Plan period, OEC members had eliminated quotas on the majority of their mutual trade. The records of OEEC meetings document the pressure applied to lagging members. When Britain attempted to slow liberalization, other members objected. When France raised barriers during a balance of payments crisis, the organization pushed for their rapid removal. The peer pressure mechanism worked because all members depended on continued American support, and American support depended on collective progress. Trade liberalization produced the gains economists predicted. Specialization increased, productivity rose, living standards improved. The economic integration created during the Marshall Plan period established patterns persisting into the present European Union. The conditionality mechanism also established a template for later international economic institutions. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, created in 1947, used similar peer review mechanisms. The World Trade Organization continues this approach. Regional trade agreements incorporate the same principles. The lesson from the archives is clear. Trade liberalization generates collective benefits. Individual governments face political incentives opposing liberalization. External conditionality, combined with peer pressure, provides the mechanism to overcome domestic resistance. American factories in 1948 produced more per worker hour than any factories in the world. This productivity advantage explained American prosperity. It also explained why American goods dominated world markets. European factories lagged far behind. The gap came not from equipment differences alone. European managers used different methods. European workers operated under different systems. European firms organized production differently. State Department analysts identified this productivity gap as a long-term threat to European recovery. Even with currency stability and trade liberalization, European industries would struggle to compete if they maintained low productivity. American goods would flood European markets. European industries would fail, unemployment would rise, communist parties would benefit. The Marshall Plan addressed this bottleneck through the Technical Assistance Program. This program brought European managers, engineers, and workers to the United States to observe American methods. It sent American experts to European factories to advise on improvements. The numbers were substantial. Over 6,000 productivity missions brought tens of thousands of Europeans to tour American facilities during the Marshall Plan years. They visited automobile plants in Detroit. They observed steel mills in Pittsburgh. They studied retail operations, agricultural techniques, and construction methods. These missions produced detailed reports. The visitors documented what they saw. They analyzed the differences between American and European practices. They proposed adaptations for their home countries. The reports reveal several consistent themes. American factories used more systematic methods for organizing work. They employed time and motion studies. They standardized parts and processes. They invested in worker training. They maintained machinery carefully. They tracked costs precisely. European visitors often expressed initial skepticism. American methods seemed impersonal. They treated workers like machines. They sacrificed craftsmanship for volume. Many visitors returned home determined to adopt selected improvements while preserving European traditions. The conditionality mechanism pushed for more comprehensive adoption. ECA officials monitored productivity gains as a metric for program success. They favored counterpart fund releases for industries demonstrating productivity improvements. They used leverage to push resistant industries toward modernization. The French steel industry provides a case study. French steel producers in 1948 used outdated equipment and traditional methods. Productivity per worker ran far below American levels. The industry required protection from international competition to survive. ECA officials negotiated a modernization program with French industry leaders. American engineers surveyed French facilities and recommended improvements. Counterpart funds financed new equipment purchases. Technical assistance brought French managers to American steel plants. The results appeared in production statistics. French steel output increased substantially during the Marshall Plan period. Productivity per worker rose. Costs fell. The industry became more competitive internationally. Similar patterns emerged across sectors and across countries. The productivity missions planted seeds for management consulting industries in Europe. They introduced concepts later formalized as operations research, quality control, and industrial engineering. They changed how European businesses operated. The long-term effects extended beyond specific techniques. The productivity missions established ongoing connections between American and European businesses. They created networks for technology transfer. They facilitated investment flows. They integrated European industry more closely with American practices. This integration served American interests. European industries adopting American methods purchased American equipment. They licensed American technologies. They became customers for American capital goods exports. The productivity program expanded markets for American industry while raising European living standards. The conditionality operated through incentives rather than commands. European businesses adopted American methods because doing so brought access to financing, to technology, and to markets. Resistance meant exclusion from these benefits. The machinery of influence worked through attraction rather than coercion. The Marshall Plan officially ended in 1952. The physical aid stopped flowing, the bilateral agreements expired, the Economic Cooperation Administration transformed into other agencies. The system created during those 4 years did not end. It expanded. It evolved. It operates today. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank existed before the Marshall Plan. These institutions played minor roles in European recovery. The Marshall Plan demonstrated how conditionality worked in practice. It provided the operational model these institutions later adopted globally. When developing nations sought assistance in the 1960s and 1970s, the international financial institutions applied lessons learned from the Marshall Plan. They attached conditions to loans. They required currency stabilization. They demanded trade liberalization. They pushed for productivity improvements. The structural adjustment programs of the 1980s and 1990s followed the Marshall Plan template directly. Countries facing debt crises received IMF support conditioned on fiscal discipline, privatization, and market reforms. The mechanism matched the counterpart fund system. Assistance flowed only when recipients implemented required policies. Critics of structural adjustment argue it imposed inappropriate policies on developing nations. Defenders respond pointing to the European precedent. The Marshall Plan conditionality forced difficult reforms on European democracies. These reforms produced economic miracles. Why should developing nations receive unconditional assistance when European nations did not? This debate continues in your world right now. When China offers infrastructure financing through the Belt and Road Initiative, observers ask what conditions attach to Chinese loans. When the United States proposes development assistance, legislators debate what requirements should accompany the money. When international institutions restructure sovereign debt, negotiators argue about policy reforms. You participate in this system whether you recognize it or not. Your government borrows money on international markets. Your banks hold assets across borders. Your job depends on trade flows shaped by international agreements. Your retirement savings include investments in countries receiving conditional assistance. The Marshall Plan archives reveal how these systems originated. They document the specific mechanisms of conditionality. They show how leverage translated into policy change. They demonstrate the difference between announced purposes and operational realities. The announced purpose of the Marshall Plan was European recovery. The operational reality involved restructuring European economies along American preferred lines. Both things happened simultaneously. European living standards rose dramatically. European economies integrated with American markets. European policies shifted toward American preferences. Understanding this duality protects you from simple narratives. The Marshall Plan was neither pure generosity nor pure exploitation. It operated through incentives aligning American interests with European recovery. It succeeded because the conditions it imposed produced genuine economic improvements. Not all conditionality works this way. When conditions impose inappropriate policies, when they ignore local circumstances, when they serve donor interests without benefiting recipients, conditionality fails. The Marshall Plan succeeded because American planners correctly identified the bottlenecks preventing European recovery and designed conditions addressing those specific bottlenecks. Currency stabilization was necessary. European economies could not recover with unstable money. Trade liberalization was necessary. European industries needed larger markets to achieve efficient scale. Productivity improvement was necessary. European workers needed higher output per hour to raise living standards. The conditions worked because they addressed real problems. The leverage worked because recipients genuinely needed assistance. The system worked because both sides benefited from the arrangement. Your understanding of modern development debates improves when you study the Marshall Plan archives. You see the origins of current controversies. You understand the precedents shaping current policies. You recognize the assumptions underlying current institutions. The files at the National Archives remain open. Scholars continue extracting new insights from the documentation. Barry Eichengreen and other economic historians have spent careers analyzing these records. Their work translates archival evidence into accessible analysis. The European Recovery Program country reports provide primary documentation of what happened in each recipient nation. The OEEC records show how peer pressure mechanisms operated. The State Department files reveal American thinking and American interests. These sources exist. They contain the evidence supporting the analysis in this script. They allow you to verify claims and extend your understanding beyond what any single presentation conveys. The $13 billion figure from your textbooks represents a starting point, not an ending point. The money mattered less than the conditions. The conditions mattered less than the mechanisms enforcing them. The mechanisms created patterns persisting into your present. When you read about modern aid debates, remember the Marshall Plan archives. When you hear arguments about conditionality, recall the counterpart fund mechanism. When you evaluate claims about development assistance, consider the productivity missions and trade liberalization requirements. History does not repeat, but patterns recur. The pattern established in 1948 continues shaping your economic environment. The institutions created during European recovery continue influencing your financial system. The debates initiated during the Marshall Plan continue in your newspapers and your legislatures. The archives remain open. The evidence awaits examination. The questions raised during European recovery demand answers relevant to your world. This is the history they never taught you in school. This is the system still running beneath the surface of international economics. This is why $13 billion rebuilt Europe, while far larger sums have failed elsewhere. The conditions made the difference. The leverage created compliance. The machinery of economic influence, constructed during the Marshall Plan, operates in your world today. Now you know how it began.